In the annals of warfare, there are moments that transcend mere tactical shifts, moments that represent a fundamental reordering of power, a seismic rupture in the very concept of how battles are fought and won. Picture, if you will, the early days of the Second World War. The vast, churning expanse of the Atlantic, an arena where the titanic struggle for supremacy was still largely defined by steel giants and silent predators. For the seasoned officers of the German Kriegsmarine, the very notion of naval might was etched into their consciousness by the colossal shadow of battleships, the awe-inspiring breadth of cruisers, and the silent, lurking menace of the U-boat. These were the instruments of their dominion, the symbols of an age-old doctrine where guns spoke loudest, and stealth could turn the tide. Aircraft carriers, to them, were something of a curiosity, perhaps useful for niche roles, supporting limited engagements, but certainly not the beating heart of a formidable fleet. They had observed the Royal Navy's carriers, yes, but often dismissed them with a dismissive wave. Small, relatively fragile vessels, seemingly requiring more protection than they offered, hardly a game-changer in the grand theater of naval combat. This perception wasn't rooted in arrogance alone, but in a deeply ingrained understanding of naval warfare, honed by decades of tradition and shaped by the unique strategic considerations of continental Europe. Their mental maps of the sea were finite, their operations tied to coastal bases, and their vision of battle centered on decisive, often close-range engagements. They believed they understood the ocean, its limitations and its rules, but the ocean, as history would dramatically reveal, held secrets they were utterly unprepared for. It was preparing to unveil a new paradigm of power, one that would not merely challenge their assumptions, but utterly dismantle them. A new Leviathan was emerging from the shipyards across the Atlantic, not just a warship, but a floating city of steel and flight decks, a mobile fortress capable of projecting power on a scale previously unimaginable. This was not just an evolution, it was a revolution. And for the German officers who first encountered these behemoths, whether through distant sightings, chilling intelligence reports, or the unsettling reality of their decks, it was nothing short of a profound, disorienting shock, a shock that would reverberate through their strategic thinking and ultimately seal their fate. They were about to witness the dawn of a new age, an age where the sea belonged not to the mightiest gun, but to the largest deck, and where the very fabric of naval warfare would be rewritten, irrevocably and undeniably. The whispers of these colossal shadows on the horizon were about to become a roaring storm, and the world of naval strategy would never be the same. The initial tremors of this impending strategic earthquake began subtly, carried on the airwaves and whispered in the debriefing rooms of U-boat commands. In the grim, claustrophobic world of submarine warfare, German U-boat captains were accustomed to being the unseen hunters, masters of surprise and shadow. Their domain was the vast, often lonely expanse of the Atlantic, where convoys, once spotted, were vulnerable prey. Their training, their instincts, their entire operational doctrine revolved around the premise of striking with impunity, often under the cloak of night or the vastness of the sea, with minimal aerial interference. The skies, they believed, belonged to land-based aircraft, whose reach was finite, whose patrols predictable. Yet, as the war progressed into 1941 and 1942, unsettling reports began to trickle back to Berlin. Tales that, at first, sounded exaggerated, almost mythical. Submarine commanders, veterans of countless patrols, spoke of immense silhouettes spotted on the far horizon, vessels of a size that defied their imagination. These were not the British carriers they knew, limited in number and capability. These were something altogether different. Floating fortresses, as some described them, combining the mass of a battleship with the vast expanse of an airfield. Imagine the cognitive dissonance, the mental struggle for a U-boat captain, whose entire world was defined by precise calculations of tonnage, speed, and armament, to suddenly encounter a vessel that seemed to defy all known naval architecture. A ship that felt less like a singular entity and more like an entire mobile continent. The very scale was disorienting. These were ships larger than anything they had ever conceived, dwarfing even their formidable battleships like the Bismarck or Tirpitz. But more than just size, these monsters brought with them a paradigm-altering capability. Constant, relentless air cover for convoys that were once thought vulnerable. In the past, convoys might enjoy protection from land-based aircraft for a few hours at either end of their journey. Now, U-boat crews reported being scoured from the skies, day and night, by dozens of aircraft operating not from distant airfields, but from these very floating islands. The balance of hunter and hunted, a fundamental tenet of submarine warfare, was beginning to tilt, ominously and irrevocably. For German officers, meticulously trained in doctrines where their U-boats could strike convoys with relative impunity, the realization that convoys might now sail under a permanent aerial shield was deeply unsettling. It wasn't just a technological advancement. It was a direct assault on the philosophical underpinnings of their entire naval strategy. Suddenly, the silent menace of the U-boat was facing eyes in the sky that could spot them, and claws that could force them to dive and hide, rendering their stealth advantage moot. The reports, initially viewed with skepticism, began to accumulate, each one corroborating the next, painting a picture of an enemy whose industrial might and strategic imagination had conjured a new dimension of naval power. This was not a minor adjustment to the battlefield. This was a complete transformation, as the war's focus inexorably shifted towards the vast, unforgiving expanses of the Pacific. The German officers, through intelligence exchanges with their Japanese allies, began to receive reports that instilled a deeper, more chilling dread. The Pacific theater, with its immense distances and island chains, was becoming the ultimate crucible for this new form of warfare. Descriptions of battles like Midway, for instance, conveyed not just the tactical brilliance of the Americans, but, more importantly, the sheer, unimaginable capacity of their carriers to project force over hundreds, even thousands of miles. For German minds, conditioned by the relatively compact geography of the Atlantic where Britain served as the central island fortress, the idea of naval air power extending across the entire breadth of the Pacific seemed almost an abstraction, a fantastical vision bordering on the impossible. Yet, the Americans were making it a brutal reality. The true weight of this reality, however, often came not through dry intelligence reports or intercepted signals, but through direct, visceral experience. There were rare but profound occasions when German prisoners of war, among them seasoned naval officers, found themselves transported aboard American carriers, whether for transfer to POW camps or for interrogation. These men, who had spent their careers commanding steel fortresses or navigating the cramped confines of a U-boat, recounted their experiences with an almost disbelieving awe. They spoke of hangar decks that stretched out like cavernous cathedrals, vast spaces packed with dozens upon dozens of aircraft, meticulously arranged in neat, intimidating rows. They described aircraft elevators rising and lowering planes with an industrial magic, a symphony of steel and precision that seemed to defy the very laws of physics. The sheer scale was overwhelming. Crews, numbering in the thousands, worked with machine-like precision, maintaining this floating city, while vast galleys fed them in shifts, an endless cycle of sustenance. Compared to the suffocating quarters of a U-boat, where every inch was crammed with machinery and every breath tasted of diesel fumes and sweat, or even the Spartan routines of a German battleship. The American carrier was an entire city adrift on the waves. It was a self-contained world, a mobile microcosm of an industrial nation. This wasn't merely a ship. It was a complex ecosystem designed for war. The profound difference was not just in size, but in purpose. German capital ships like the Bismarck or Tirpitz were enormous by European standards, yet their mass was predominantly dedicated to heavy armor, massive artillery, and the internal machinery necessary for gunnery duels. An American carrier, by contrast, matched them in size, but devoted its vast tonnage to an entirely different purpose: housing, launching, and maintaining a massive air wing, fuel reserves, ammunition, and the logistical support for continuous flight operations. German officers couldn't help but realize that one such vessel was the equivalent of several land-based airfields, moving in formation, capable of launching wave after wave of sorties, delivering devastating blows far beyond the range of any battleship gun. This vision systematically undermined the very foundation of their naval doctrine, which had long been centered on decisive gunnery duels and the stealthy, independent campaigns of submarines. They were looking at a future they had not planned for, a future that rendered their own monumental achievements tragically obsolete. Adding to the profound shock was the apparent casualness, almost an abundance, with which the Americans deployed these giants of the sea. While the Kriegsmarine agonized over every sortie of its limited fleet, carefully conserving its precious few capital ships, American carriers seemed to appear in multiple theaters at once, a relentless, ubiquitous presence. By 1942 and 1943, intelligence reports, once dismissed as exaggeration, began to speak with undeniable authority of new classes of carriers being launched with astonishing industrial speed. Each successive vessel was larger, more advanced, and more capable than the last, a continuous cascade of power pouring from American shipyards. To German officers who had witnessed firsthand the agonizing constraints on their own shipbuilding, hampered by chronic resource shortages, the relentless pressure of Allied bombing, and the inherent limitations of their war economy, the American ability to produce these floating fortresses appeared almost otherworldly. It was less like conventional shipbuilding, and more like an act of industrial magic, a relentless, seemingly inexhaustible outpouring of steel into technology. The contrast was stark, humiliating, and ultimately profoundly demoralizing. They were not merely fighting a powerful navy. They were fighting an industrial titan that could churn out instruments of war at a rate that defied comprehension. But beyond the cold statistics and raw dimensions, there was something deeply psychological about these initial encounters. German officers realized that the mere presence of an aircraft carrier irrevocably changed the character of a naval engagement. A fleet escorted by a carrier was not just a collection of ships. It was a multidimensional war machine. It possessed eyes that could stretch far beyond the horizon, reconnaissance aircraft providing an unparalleled awareness of the battlefield. It had claws that could strike submarines before they even lined up for a torpedo run, turning the hunter into the hunted. It possessed the operational flexibility to support amphibious landings, to disrupt enemy supply lines with devastating effect, and to dominate the skies wherever it sailed, effectively creating its own mobile bubble of air superiority. For officers steeped in the venerable traditions of surface warfare, where engagements were often dictated by visibility, gun range, and armor thickness, this was nothing less than a revolution at sea. It was a fundamental redefinition of what naval power truly meant. It is little wonder, then, that when German officers spoke of their first encounters with America's aircraft carriers, their words carried tones of disbelief, a profound sense of having stepped into a new dimension of naval power. This dimension was not simply about individual ships. It was about the seamless integration of industrial might, technological sophistication, and strategic imagination. The floating cities they glimpsed were not just ships. They were a declaration, a bold statement of how the war at sea would be fought, and, ultimately, how it would be decisively won. Their very existence was a harbinger of a future they were utterly unprepared to face. In the early 1940s, to the traditional German naval mind, a warship was unequivocally defined by its guns and its armor. The sheer grandeur of the Bismarck, the intimidating profile of the Tirpitz, lay not just in their size but in their massive cannons, capable of unleashing devastating broadsides, in the thickness of their steel plating, and in the immense prestige they carried as tangible symbols of Reich power and engineering prowess. These were ships built for direct confrontation, for the decisive gunnery duel, a philosophy rooted in centuries of naval history. Aircraft carriers, in stark contrast, seemed to many German observers to be inherently fragile. They were perceived as overly reliant on their planes, which could be easily shot down or rendered ineffective by mere bad weather. How could such a seemingly vulnerable vessel, essentially a giant target, form the core of a powerful fleet? Yet, as the Kriegsmarine began to absorb more detailed intelligence about the American Essex-class carriers and their predecessors, they unearthed something that profoundly defied their ingrained assumptions. These ships were not fragile auxiliaries. They were engineering marvels, true floating cities, purpose-built to endure the rigors of global warfare and to dominate the seas through their unprecedented capacity. The floating city metaphor was far more than just poetic license. It was a literal description of their functional reality. American carriers resembled colossal industrial complexes stretched across massive steel hulls, often extending nearly 3 football fields in length. German officers, when they first studied detailed descriptions and reconnaissance photographs, were genuinely astonished by the sheer, unadulterated scale. Flight decks long enough to launch entire squadrons of heavy bombers, cavernous hangars stacked with dozens upon dozens of aircraft, fuel stores vast enough to sustain operations for weeks on end, and fully equipped workshops capable of repairing severely damaged planes on the spot. These features imbued the carriers with a level of self-sufficiency that Germany, constrained by its continental geography and logistical vulnerabilities, had never even dared to imagine for a warship. To those trained in the European naval traditions, accustomed to ships relying heavily on shore bases for resupply and repair, the idea of a single vessel that could house, maintain, and deploy an entire wing of aircraft, independently, for extended periods, seemed less like naval engineering and more like science fiction brought to terrifying reality. The very design philosophy was a profound shock. Unlike the armored citadels of German battleships, which prioritized guns and armor above all else, American carriers unapologetically sacrificed heavy gun turrets in favor of vast runways and an intricate aviation infrastructure. At first, this struck many German officers as a reckless, almost suicidal gamble. Why would you strip a warship of its primary weapons, its powerful guns, to make way for vulnerable aircraft? But reports from the Atlantic and Pacific soon clarified the brutal truth. The aircraft themselves were the weapons, more versatile, more lethal, and far-reaching than any cannon. A single carrier could launch reconnaissance planes to scout hundreds of miles in all directions, dive bombers to strike enemy ships with devastating precision, and fighters to defend the entire fleet against air attacks. The ship itself transcended its role as a mere vessel. It became a mobile fortress of aviation, fundamentally redefining what naval power truly meant in the modern age. The paradigm had shifted, and the Germans were struggling to keep pace. If the exterior scale and design of American carriers were astonishing, the internal environment, the sense of a city at sea, was even more striking, profoundly unsettling to the German officers who learned about it. These floating metropolises contained vast mess halls, capable of feeding thousands of sailors in continuous shifts, a testament to American logistical foresight. Sleeping quarters, though still communal, dwarfed the cramped, multi-tiered bunks found on German warships, offering a degree of personal space previously unheard of in wartime naval service. Medical bays resembled small, fully equipped hospitals, staffed by a comprehensive team of doctors and nurses, a far cry from the single, often overwhelmed ship's doctor improvising with limited tools on a U-boat or cruiser. What truly astonished German officers, however, was the inclusion of dedicated recreational facilities, fully equipped gyms, barber shops, even movie projectors that transformed hangar decks into makeshift cinemas for thousands of sailors. These were luxuries utterly unthinkable on a German cruiser, or, heaven forbid, a U-boat, where every cubic centimeter was dedicated to combat function and crew comfort was a distant, often unattainable afterthought. Many German officers initially dismissed these as frivolous, wasteful indulgences, betraying a soft, pampered enemy. But as they delved deeper into the operational philosophy, the simple yet brilliant logic behind these amenities became chillingly clear. A crew sustained by comfort, routine, and a sense of community could endure long, arduous deployments and remain combat-ready far longer than men crammed into steel coffins, battling not just the enemy, but also the insidious creeping effects of claustrophobia, boredom, and low morale. German officers who eventually glimpsed these floating communities, whether through captured documents or as prisoners themselves, were forced to admit a profound truth. Morale, logistics, and human endurance had been meticulously engineered into the very design of these vessels. This was not just about better living, it was about maximizing human performance as a weapon of war. It highlighted a stark philosophical difference between the two navies, one focused on steel and sacrifice, the other on steel and the welfare of its human operators. The meticulous operational choreography aboard these carriers also left an indelible impression. Elevators carried planes between the hangar and flight deck with mechanical efficiency, a constant, precise ballet of machinery and human coordination. Crews performed rehearsed routines that seemed less like frantic wartime effort and more like an industrial ballet. Each sailor, often color-coded by role, moving with a purpose born of intense training and repeated practice. launching dozens of aircraft in quick succession, recovering them with precision landings, and then rapidly preparing the next wave was a process perfected to near automation. On German ships, every major maneuver, every significant action was dominated by the strict authority of officers and an unbending hierarchy. On American carriers, however, sailors themselves were empowered by their training and by well-designed systems to act decisively, often with considerable initiative, producing a seamless rhythm of constant motion. German accounts noted this organizational style as both alien and intimidating. It was a more flexible, decentralized system that, paradoxically, achieved greater precision and speed in high-stakes operations. Another point of profound disbelief came from the carrier's astonishing logistical autonomy. With their own machine shops, vast stores of spare parts, and immense aviation fuel reserves, these ships could function independently of immediate shore bases for extended periods. A carrier group could steam into remote waters and operate for entire campaigns without needing to wait for vulnerable supply convoys, without having to retreat to a friendly port for crucial repairs or resupply. This capability was nearly inconceivable to the German Navy, which was bound tightly to European harbors and vulnerable supply routes, its operations always limited by the reach of its logistical tail. The Americans, by stunning contrast, had created a war machine that carried its own lifelines, enabling a strategic flexibility that seemed boundless, a true projection of power unconstrained by geography. Perhaps most shocking of all, beyond the sheer size and remarkable self-sufficiency, was the unprecedented scale of aviation capacity. Where British carriers, for example, carried a modest number of planes, typically in the range of 30 to 50, American giants boasted air groups often ranging from 80 to over 100 aircraft. German officers, accustomed to thinking in terms of surface gunnery duels and the limited air support from land bases, struggled profoundly to process this reality. The comparison was staggering, almost surreal. A single American carrier could deliver the firepower and operational versatility equivalent to several land-based airfields, but with the critical advantage of mobility, moving wherever needed, striking targets that had previously considered themselves safe behind the vastness of oceans and continents. It was as if the Americans had learned not only to master the seas, but to bend geography itself to their strategic advantage. The floating city concept, therefore, went far beyond mere dimensions or tonnage. It embodied an entirely new philosophy of war, a strategic paradigm shift. The Americans had consciously chosen mobility, projection, and sustainability over the brute force of heavy armor and static artillery. They built ships that could carry not only weapons, but the entire infrastructure, the human capital, and the logistical support necessary to sustain an entire campaign. In doing so, they inadvertently, or perhaps intentionally, created a new kind of warfare where distance and isolation no longer offered protection, where the enemy could bring the fight directly to any shore, any fleet, any convoy, at any time. German officers, reviewing battle reports, studying reconnaissance photographs, and poring over intercepted communications, confessed among themselves in hushed tones that the balance of naval power was shifting, irrevocably and undeniably. The age of the battleship, the grand, steel-plated leviathan that had dominated naval strategy for decades, was closing. A new era, the age of the aircraft carrier, had begun, and Germany, tragically, was on the wrong side of that historical divide. In the quiet solitude of post-war memoirs and debriefings, some German naval officers openly admitted that they had fundamentally underestimated the true potential of these carriers until it was catastrophically too late. They vividly recalled the first time they saw detailed images or read comprehensive intelligence reports of these floating cities, and the chilling realization that Germany possessed no answer to them, no viable counter-strategy, no comparable instrument of power. The Reich had gambled everything on the perceived invincibility of its U-boat fleet and the prestige of a handful of capital ships. Meanwhile, across the vast expanse of the Atlantic, America had systematically constructed an armada of moving airfields, an entirely new class of weapon that redefined the very nature of maritime conflict. The shock was not merely in the cold, hard statistics of steel and tonnage. It was in the profound, almost existential realization that Germany's naval imagination had been too narrow, too constrained by historical precedent, too rigid for the dynamic, rapidly evolving demands of modern warfare. For the men who had spent their entire careers worshiping artillery and armor, the American carrier was a revelation, a stunning testament to innovation, and a stark, undeniable warning. It stood as irrefutable proof that wars were no longer won by clinging stubbornly to old doctrines, but by daring to reimagine the battlefield, by embracing technological disruption, and by harnessing industrial might on an unprecedented scale. To these German officers, the floating cities of war were both terrifying and awe-inspiring, symbols of a new, terrifying age, an age they had not been prepared to fight, let alone win. Life aboard America's aircraft carriers, to German officers who heard or later saw it, was nothing short of surreal. For men accustomed to the suffocating Spartan environments of U-boats, where every inch was crammed with machinery, and human comfort was a distant, often cruel joke, or the rigidly functional routines of German surface ships, the American carrier represented another world entirely. It was a city drifting across the sea, with its own complex rhythms, its own peculiar comforts, and its own surprisingly fluid hierarchies. It was undeniably a warship, yes, but it was also a fully functional community, meticulously engineered to keep thousands of men not merely alive, but effective and mentally robust through months of continuous deployment in hostile waters. The more German officers learned about these ships, whether from meticulously gathered intelligence reports, detailed captured documents, or even their own first-hand, albeit involuntary experiences as prisoners of war, the more they realized they were confronting something profoundly alien, fundamentally different from their own deeply entrenched naval traditions and philosophies. One of the first things that consistently astonished them was the sheer, almost decadent sense of space. On a U-boat, every steel inch was relentlessly crammed with machinery, torpedoes, bunks stacked 3 high, and vital equipment. The air itself was thick with diesel fumes, the pervasive odor of sweat, and the constant, gnawing anxiety of confinement. On German battleships, while space was certainly more generous, it remained rigidly functional, characterized by narrow corridors, compact mess halls, and tight, Spartan cabins. By stark, almost unbelievable contrast, American carriers spread out like floating towns. The hangar deck alone, a vast cavern of steel, could have easily swallowed an entire U-boat, and still left ample room for dozens more aircraft, maintenance bays, and bustling crews. The flight deck stretched longer than most European streets, an expanse of concrete and steel upon which the drama of naval aviation unfolded. To walk from bow to stern was to embark on a considerable journey, a stark contrast to the confined, often claustrophobic fighting machines German officers were accustomed to. This vastness, this almost overwhelming sense of open space at sea, seemed not just efficient, but almost decadent, a luxurious indulgence in the midst of total war. It spoke volumes about a nation that could afford such spaciousness, even in its instruments of destruction. Then there was the truly astonishing matter of living conditions. Intelligence reports meticulously described vast mess halls where hundreds could eat at once, often offering menus with a variety and freshness that German sailors could only dream of, a stark departure from their own monotonous rations. Advanced refrigeration systems kept fresh supplies readily available across weeks at sea, a logistical marvel. While German crews often subsisted on hard bread, ersatz coffee, canned meats, and thin utilitarian soups, American sailors queued up for hot, varied meals that frequently included fresh vegetables, eggs, and, to the utter bewilderment of their adversaries, even ice cream. Prisoners who experienced these meals firsthand later admitted that the sheer abundance was demoralizing in itself. How could Germany hope to sustain morale and enduring fighting spirit when the enemy's sailors lived as if they were in a floating cafeteria rather than a steel cage of war? The psychological impact of such a stark contrast in basic living standards was immense, eroding the German belief in their own stoicism as a strategic advantage. Beyond sustenance, the American carriers also housed medical facilities that German officers likened to small, fully equipped hospitals. These were not makeshift sick bays. They were meticulously planned surgical bays, wards for the wounded, and comprehensive trained staff ready to handle not only battle injuries, but also the widespread illnesses that could sweep through large crews at sea. For German sailors, medical treatment was often rudimentary, with a single ship's doctor improvising with limited tools and even more limited supplies. On the American carriers, medicine was industrialized, prepared for scale, and seamlessly woven into the demanding rhythm of war. This was not merely a matter of comfort or humanitarian concern. It reflected a logistical depth and an operational philosophy that Germany simply could not match. A wounded sailor on an American carrier might return to duty in days or weeks, benefiting from prompt, advanced care, while his German counterpart could linger in pain, rendered useless, or even die for lack of proper medical attention. The stark reality was that the American system valued and invested in its human capital, understanding that a healthy, well-cared-for crew was a more effective fighting force. Even recreation was purposefully built into the system. German officers were genuinely astounded to learn that carriers included dedicated gyms, fully functioning barbershops, and designated spaces where films were projected for entertainment. These luxuries struck many as utterly frivolous, a wasteful diversion of precious resources in wartime, until they grasped their deeper psychological purpose, keeping thousands of men sane, engaged, and mentally resilient during endless monotonous stretches of sea duty, far from home and family. By stark contrast, boredom, crushing claustrophobia, and the grinding stress of relentless combat were constant, insidious enemies aboard German vessels, silently sapping morale and discipline, often more effectively than enemy fire. The Americans, with their seemingly counterintuitive emphasis on comfort and well-being, seemed to instinctively understand that war at sea was as much about the endurance of the spirit as it was about the endurance of steel, a profound insight that Germany had largely overlooked. The order and discipline aboard these carriers also impressed the Germans, though often in unexpected ways that challenged their own ingrained notions. German warships were governed by an almost rigid, unyielding hierarchy, with every action controlled by the unquestioned authority of officers, and every command meticulously followed down the chain. On American carriers, however, intelligence reports described a more flexible, dynamic style. Sailors were highly trained for specific, often complex tasks, and were empowered through that training and trust to execute them with astonishing speed and initiative. Flight deck operations, in particular, struck German observers as astonishingly efficient, a bewildering ballet of organized chaos. Hundreds of men, often working in color-coded uniforms denoting their specific roles, directed planes, fueled them, armed them, and cleared the decks in mere minutes, a flurry of synchronized activity. What might have seemed utterly chaotic to an outsider was, in fact, a carefully choreographed ballet of men and machines, a testament to intense training and meticulous planning. German officers, with their inherent preference for strict centralized order, admitted that this looser, more decentralized American system somehow achieved a greater precision and far greater speed in critical moments. The psychological effect of all this, the cumulative weight of these observations, could not be ignored by the German leadership. For German officers, the contrast was profoundly humiliating, a stark and undeniable indictment of their own system. They realized that their sailors fought under conditions of scarcity, unrelenting discomfort, and relentless grinding pressure, often with diminishing returns. Meanwhile, American crews fought with the inherent strength of abundance, backed by comprehensive systems that meticulously cared for their needs, mitigated their stress, and constantly multiplied their overall effectiveness. The carriers were not just war machines. They were a living embodiment of the American industrial and philosophical approach, which implicitly held that human performance could be maximized by investing directly in the welfare of the worker, even the soldier. To German minds, trained in doctrines of stoic sacrifice, rigid discipline, and making do with less, this was both profoundly alien and disturbingly, frighteningly effective. It was a new dimension of warfare, where human capital was as critical as steel and strategy. Beyond the direct comforts and operational efficiency, there was also the sheer scale of coordination that permeated every aspect of carrier life, knitting together disparate roles into a cohesive, unstoppable force. Pilots, mechanics, flight deck crews, gunners, cooks, doctors, navigators, engineers. Each was not merely an individual, but a finely tuned cog in the larger, intricate machinery of the ship. German officers who studied these vessels meticulously remarked on how the entire carrier functioned like a small, self-contained city-state, a mobile microcosm of a highly organized society where each citizen had a clearly defined place, a critical task, and an understanding of how their individual efforts contributed to the collective mission. The warship, in this sense, was not just a vessel, but a society afloat, complete with its own complex hierarchy, a nascent culture forged by shared purpose and deeply ingrained routines that ensured its continuous, seamless operation. The sense of permanence and inherent stability it conveyed was overwhelming, especially when contrasted with the fragile, often precarious existence of German naval crews, constantly battling shortages, attrition, and the looming threat of destruction. For many German officers, This profound realization was crushing. They were confronting an enemy who had built not only superior ships, but entire systems that could sustain warfare in ways the Third Reich, despite its initial industrial might and military prowess, simply could not replicate. These floating cities vividly revealed America's unparalleled ability to blend cutting-edge technology, vast logistical capacity, and a deep pragmatic concern for human welfare into a seamless, incredibly potent instrument of power. If Germany's warships, like the Bismarck, symbolized steel will, defiant power, and rigid discipline, the American carriers symbolized something far larger, far more encompassing. An entire civilization mobilized for total war, where every resource, every human element, was brought to bear with overwhelming effect. In their post-war reflections, often shared in interviews, interrogations, and memoirs, German officers frequently confessed that the carriers left them with an enduring sense of futility, a profound understanding of their insurmountable disadvantage. How could they possibly hope to prevail against a nation that sent to sea not just machines of destruction, but entire societies complete with comforts, resilience, and an almost inexhaustible capacity for renewal? The floating cities were more than just ships. They were tangible proof that America could project not just firepower and steel, but an entire way of life, a logistical and industrial philosophy, and that this way of life was meticulously designed to endure, to outlast, and ultimately to overcome the fiercest storms of war. The very existence of these carriers shattered the illusion that sheer willpower and tactical brilliance alone could triumph over overwhelming, sustained industrial and human capacity. If the sheer size and comparatively opulent living conditions aboard American carriers astonished German officers, the true gut-wrenching shock came when they finally grasped the gargantuan industrial power that had made such vessels possible in the first place. For Germany, every major warship, every capital ship, was the product of years of meticulous planning, a laborious allocation of scarce resources, and often fierce, politically charged debates within the Reich's leadership. A ship, like the Bismarck, for example, had been a singular national achievement, a monumental undertaking requiring enormous expense, political will, and the dedication of significant portions of the nation's industrial capacity. Each one was a bespoke masterpiece, built with painstaking care, almost irreplaceable. The Americans, by stark contrast, seemed to treat carriers not as rare, precious treasures, but as items rolling off an assembly line, units in a vast, continuous production flow. German intelligence reports from 1942 and 1943 spoke with a chilling disbelief of shipyards along the American coasts, launching carriers at a pace that defied all rational imagination. Where Germany struggled desperately to repair damage from relentless Allied bombing raids, and to keep pace with its U-boat production, the United States appeared to be laying keels for new Essex-class carriers as if they were simple merchant ships, mass-produced and endlessly replaceable. Entire classes of these monumental vessels were being completed in mere months, not the years that such a task would have taken, or indeed did take, in Germany. To officers who had fought through endless grinding shortages of steel, oil, and skilled labor, these reports initially seemed exaggerated, almost like enemy propaganda designed to demoralize. Yet, the brutal reality, as it slowly but undeniably emerged, was worse than any propaganda could convey. America's industrial engine was simply overwhelming, operating on a scale and with a philosophy that was utterly alien to the German experience. The fundamental difference lay not just in raw resources, but in scale and philosophy. Germany's war industry was often fragmented, plagued by internal competition for Hitler's favor, frequently mismanaged, and chronically undersupplied due to its continental limitations and strategic blunders. America's was a centralized, coordinated, and incredibly efficient behemoth, fueled by a vast, seemingly limitless reservoir of raw materials drawn from across a continent. Carriers were not built sequentially, one after another, but in parallel, with dozens of shipyards working simultaneously on multiple vessels. German officers realized with growing despair that even if one carrier were sunk, another, often newer and more advanced, would soon replace it. The sense of permanence, of inexhaustible power, was devastating. While Germany clung to every battleship, every U-boat, as irreplaceable, America treated its giants as expendable assets within a greater, continuous flow of production. What particularly unsettled German strategists was the insidious way these carriers embodied the seemingly unbreakable union of a vibrant democracy and an unrestrained industrial might. Sailors who ate well and lived with relative comfort were supported by an economy that had mobilized for total war without collapsing under the strain. German officers knew intimately how brittle their own system was, where severe shortages, relentless rationing, and the ever-present threat of air raids strained both civilian and military morale to breaking point. In America, factories churned out ships, planes, and supplies with astonishing speed, while civilians still enjoyed consumer goods and a relative degree of stability and prosperity. It was as if the carriers themselves were physical, undeniable proof that the Reich was fighting a nation whose resources and organizational capacity bordered on the limitless. To German naval minds, this industrial superiority meant that no tactical victory, no matter how brilliant or hard-won, could truly shift the fundamental balance of power. Even if a U-boat wolf pack or a surface raider managed, against incredible odds, to sink a carrier, the Americans would simply replace it, and likely with a newer, larger, and even more advanced version. The floating cities of war were not isolated achievements. They were merely the visible tips of a colossal, unseen industrial iceberg, whose true depth was incomprehensible. For German officers, this recognition was profoundly bitter. They were not merely fighting ships. They were fighting the entire integrated machinery of a continent-spanning nation, a force of nature that dwarfed their own ambitions. In the end, the shock that permeated the German naval command was not just about the steel and tonnage of these colossal ships, but about something far more fundamental: time. Germany was rapidly running out of it, while America seemed able to produce more of everything with every passing month, every passing day. Each new carrier launched, each successive intelligence report confirming their relentless production, was another stark, painful reminder that the Reich's naval dream, its very ambition to dominate the seas, was doomed, not primarily by superior tactics on the battlefield, but by an inescapable, brutal arithmetic of industrial output. For German officers, steeped for decades in the doctrines of precise surface gunnery and cunning submarine warfare, the profound realization that America's carriers carried not only vast crews, but entire wings of aircraft was profoundly disorienting, a complete inversion of their understanding of naval power. They had meticulously built their entire naval strategy around the brute force of battleships and the silent stealth of U-boats. Yet, the carriers introduced an entirely new, terrifying reality. The ship's true weapons were not its steel armor or its formidable guns, which were comparatively light for its size, but the squadrons of aircraft that could reach hundreds of miles beyond the horizon, striking with impunity, projecting power on a scale previously unimaginable. The reports that filtered back from the treacherous waters of the Atlantic, and even more vividly, from the vast, unforgiving expanses of the Pacific, described Allied fleets that seemed to fight with invisible hands, striking from distances where no traditional warship could respond. Convoys, once thought safe beyond the finite range of land-based air cover, now found themselves under constant, relentless threat, day and night. Dive bombers appeared suddenly, screaming from the sky. Torpedo planes struck with devastating precision, and ubiquitous fighter patrols dominated skies that had once been assumed empty, safe havens for U-boats or reconnaissance flights. German officers understood with a chilling clarity that these aircraft could scout, attack, and defend simultaneously, giving the Americans eyes, claws, and shields that stretched far beyond any traditional fleet, effectively expanding the battlefield to an entirely new, multidimensional realm. The sheer scale of aviation aboard the carriers was staggering, where even the more capable British carriers might launch a modest handful of planes, an American Essex-class vessel carried close to 100, meticulously coordinated into powerful air wings. These aircraft could strike enemy warships with impunity, hunt submarines relentlessly, and even provide decisive support for amphibious landings, fundamentally transforming the tactical landscape. The cumulative effect was to expand the battlefield to a size and complexity the Kriegsmarine had never prepared for, had never even truly conceived of. Suddenly, no surface ship was truly safe, no submarine truly immune to detection, and no coastline genuinely beyond reach. The tactical consequences of this paradigm shift became terrifyingly clear after early Allied landings, crucially supported by these powerful carriers. German officers watched in disbelief as carrier-based air wings neutralized formidable coastal defenses long before ground troops even approached the beaches, paving the way for seemingly effortless invasions. They saw how carrier air power effectively protected Allied fleets from the formidable Luftwaffe, projecting American power over contested waters with relentless, suffocating pressure. Each aircraft lost could be replaced, each wave launched without hesitation, because the carriers carried not just planes, but the industrial might of America within their very steel decks, a constant wellspring of replenishment. For German naval strategists, this was devastating. Their own doctrine of decisive surface battles, honed over decades, simply collapsed when aircraft could sink a battleship before it even came within range to fire its massive guns. Submarines, once the terror of convoys, found themselves relentlessly stalked from the skies, their stealth advantage negated. Even apparent victories seemed hollow. Sinking one carrier, a monumental achievement in itself, was rendered meaningless when replacements were already on the way. Newer, stronger, and more numerous. In conversations recorded after the war, in hushed tones of reflection and regret, German officers openly admitted that the aircraft carrier was the true revolution of naval warfare, the decisive innovation of the conflict. It was not just a ship, they acknowledged, but a floating airfield that bent both geography and strategy to America's inexorable will, where a battleship, for all its power, could dominate only a specific patch of ocean through its formidable gunnery. A carrier, with its far-reaching air wing, could dominate an entire region, extending its influence hundreds of miles in every direction. For the Kriegsmarine, this was perhaps the most bitter lesson of all. The future of war at sea had arrived, with undeniable force. And Germany, trapped by its adherence to older doctrines and its limited industrial capacity, possessed no viable answer, no effective counter. When German officers studied the Mediterranean theater, they found further chilling proof of the carrier's transformative power. By 1942, Allied operations in North Africa and later in Sicily vividly revealed how these floating cities could unilaterally reshape entire campaigns, nullifying previously insurmountable obstacles. German and Italian forces had once relied heavily on the narrowness of the Mediterranean Sea, believing that their shore-based aircraft and formidable Axis naval assets could effectively keep the sea under their watchful iron grip. They saw it as an Axis lake, constrained and controllable. But when American and British carriers appeared in force, they extended the Allies' reach into waters previously thought secure, turning the Axis advantage into a profound vulnerability. Reports of Operation Torch, the massive Allied landings in North Africa in late 1942, deeply unsettled German officers. They documented how carrier-based aircraft provided continuous, relentless air cover for vast convoys carrying hundreds of thousands of men and their equipment across the Atlantic, an unprecedented logistical feat. Luftwaffe squadrons, previously dominant and stationed in Tunisia and Sardinia, found themselves harassed, intercepted, and often destroyed long before they could even reach striking distance of the vulnerable convoys. German accounts noted, with a mix of awe and despair, that the Allies seemed to literally carry their own airfields with them, able to unleash waves of fighters and bombers wherever needed at any time. For the first time, the Mediterranean was no longer a predictable chessboard where the Axis controlled the air. It had become an unpredictable, hostile environment, dominated by the relentless presence of carrier aviation. The invasion of Sicily in 1943 only reinforced this brutal lesson, making it tragically undeniable. Carriers provided unparalleled, continuous support for the landing forces, systematically pounding coastal defenses into submission, interdicting desperately needed enemy reinforcements, and shielding the vulnerable amphibious fleet from counterattacks with an impenetrable aerial umbrella. German officers who had long dismissed large-scale amphibious operations as inherently vulnerable and prohibitively risky now watched in disbelief as carrier-based aviation made them not only possible, but overwhelmingly, devastatingly effective. The carriers created a protective dome of air superiority, under which ground troops could advance almost unhindered, securing beachheads and pushing inland with unprecedented speed. Traditional defenses, meticulously designed for artillery duels and coastal batteries, simply collapsed under this relentless aerial assault, rendered obsolete by the new paradigm of warfare. Captured German documents from the Mediterranean front vividly reveal a deepening sense of desperation among field commanders. They demanded more Luftwaffe support, more air cover, more intervention, but the planes flying from distant European bases, hampered by range limitations and logistical bottlenecks, simply could not sustain the same tempo or intensity as the carrier squadrons operating a mere few miles offshore. Every hour, American carriers could launch fresh sorties, bringing a continuous, crushing pressure. Every day they could maintain this relentless tempo without pause, without needing to withdraw for rearming or refueling. German officers recognized this with growing despair as the decisive advantage. Carriers compressed time and distance in ways that Axis forces simply could not counter, accelerating the tempo of battle and overwhelming any static defense. In post-war reflections, some German naval officers openly admitted that the Mediterranean theater demonstrated, in chilling detail, precisely what they had feared since first learning of America's carrier program. The carriers, they realized, were not merely defensive shields for convoys, as they had initially hoped. They were powerful, offensive engines of conquest, capable of projecting overwhelming force with surgical precision. They allowed the Allies to land where they wished, strike at will, and rapidly overwhelm local forces before they could react, before reinforcements could arrive. To officers who once believed in the inherent security of fortified coasts and the strategic advantage of narrow, confined seas, the Mediterranean campaigns proved, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that geography itself had been fundamentally rewritten. The carriers had, through sheer operational dominance, effectively turned the Mediterranean into an allied lake, their decks serving as mobile strongholds that no static defense, no fixed coastal battery, no land-based air force could possibly withstand. For German officers, the lesson was brutal, undeniable, and utterly disheartening. Control of the sea no longer depended on the massive guns of battleships or the static power of shore batteries, but on the overwhelming mobile dominance of floating airfields. While the Mediterranean exposed Germany to the direct, immediate power of Allied carriers, it was the Pacific theater that truly filled German officers with a deeper, far more haunting dread. Reports flowed in through military attachés stationed in Tokyo and through meticulously intercepted dispatches, painting a terrifying picture. The Americans were waging a new, utterly ruthless kind of war against Japan, and the undisputed centerpiece of this revolutionary strategy was the aircraft carrier. To German strategists, watching from afar, it was like observing the future of warfare unfold in real time. A terrifying preview of what might eventually be brought to bear against them. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 became a pivotal case study, a moment of profound revelation. German officers read, with a mixture of disbelief and growing horror, that 4 Japanese carriers, once symbols of invincible naval air power, had been systematically destroyed in a single, decisive engagement. The Americans, utilizing brilliant, code-breaking intelligence, precise coordination, and relentless airstrikes launched from their own carriers, had proven that these floating airfields could annihilate one another in battles fought entirely beyond the range of traditional guns, often without the opposing fleets ever seeing each other. For officers raised on the sacred idea of the decisive surface clash, where steel met steel in a glorious, brutal exchange of fire, it was a stunning, epoch-defining reversal. Naval combat, they realized with a shudder, had abruptly left the age of steel duels and entered, irrevocably, an age of wings, flight decks, and aerial supremacy. As the Pacific War raged on, relentless and brutal, German intelligence diligently gathered accounts of the Americans' audacious, island-hopping campaigns. Each new island seized by the American forces was supported by carriers that brought their own airfields directly to the fight, eliminating the dire need for vulnerable construction under relentless enemy fire. Japanese forces, dug deep into their island fortresses, were pounded day and night by squadrons of aircraft rotating seamlessly from carrier decks, a constant, inexhaustible rain of bombs and bullets. German officers, meticulously reviewing these reports, understood the terrifying implications. If such methods were ever brought to the Atlantic, no harbor, no coastal installation, no convoy, no matter how heavily fortified or protected, would remain safe. The very geography of Europe would be rendered irrelevant. Even more unsettling, however, was the relentless tempo and astonishing resilience of American operations. German reports frequently highlighted how damaged carriers, seemingly crippled in battle, were repaired with astonishing speed, often at sea or in forward bases, while new ones rolled from shipyards in a steady, unbroken stream, a continuous deluge of fresh power. Unlike Germany's rare and utterly irreplaceable battleships, which, once lost, left an irreplaceable void, the Americans treated carriers as renewable assets within a greater, systemic approach to warfare. This industrial resilience, this ability to absorb blows and immediately replace losses, meant that even major defeats or significant attrition did not, and could not, slow their relentless advance. To German officers, the lesson was stark, inescapable, and utterly terrifying. America could absorb devastating blows, suffer significant losses, and yet respond with even greater strength, an absolute nightmare scenario for any strategist. By 1944, when the Battle of the Philippine Sea showcased what became infamously known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, German observers saw confirmation, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that American carrier aviation had reached a level of overwhelming supremacy that no Axis force, either German or Japanese, could possibly match or hope to counter. Hundreds of Japanese planes were shot down, annihilated in the skies, while the American fleet remained largely untouched, an almost surgical, one-sided victory. German officers admitted among themselves, often in grim, hushed tones, that if the Kriegsmarine ever faced such a concentrated, overwhelming power directly, it would be utterly annihilated in a matter of hours. The Pacific War became, in their haunted minds, a chilling mirror of what might eventually come to Europe, a terrifying premonition of their own inevitable destruction. German officers increasingly feared that one day these colossal floating cities would indeed sail into the Atlantic in overwhelming numbers, bringing the same ruin and devastation to German coasts that they had so brutally inflicted upon Japan. It was not just a tactical concern, a cold calculation of military disadvantage. It was a profound psychological one. The carriers, in their minds, symbolized a kind of inevitability, an unstoppable force, tangible proof that America's reach was global, its power unanswerable, and its industrial capacity limitless. They were facing an enemy who could not only fight but could continually renew its strength, relentlessly, indefinitely. By the time the war finally drew to its brutal, devastating close, the indelible image of America's aircraft carriers lingered heavily, almost like a phantom limb, in the minds of German officers. In the quiet solitude of post-war interrogations and the reflective pages of their memoirs, they often returned to the same word when attempting to describe these vessels: unfassbar. Incomprehensible. The carriers were far more than just ships. They embodied an industrial and strategic philosophy so utterly beyond Germany's reach, so fundamentally different from their own worldview, that it left many with a deep, pervasive sense of futility and despair. Captured admirals, men who had commanded fleets and shaped naval strategy for decades, openly admitted that their cherished pre-war doctrines had been rendered obsolete almost overnight. Their meticulously crafted plans and theories swept away by the relentless tide of innovation. The battleship, once the unquestioned pride of the Reich, the apex of naval engineering and power, had been exposed as a tragic relic, a monumental anachronism in the face of overwhelming air power. Submarines, though still deadly and capable of inflicting grievous losses, could no longer dominate seas that were constantly patrolled by the ever-vigilant eyes and destructive claws of carrier aircraft. Even the heavily fortified coastlines, in which Adolf Hitler had placed so much misguided faith, the fabled Atlantic Wall, seemed inherently vulnerable when a fleet could bring its own airfields, its own overwhelming air superiority, directly to the fight, bypassing static defenses entirely. Officers confessed, with a heavy burden of self-reproach, that their training, their deeply ingrained assumptions, and their very imagination had failed them. They had meticulously prepared for the last war, fighting with the doctrines and instruments of a bygone era, not the dynamic, technologically advanced, and industrially sustained conflict that America was determined to fight, and ultimately to win. Personal testimonies from those difficult post-war years revealed the immense emotional weight of this crushing realization. Some officers vividly described their profound shock at being transported aboard American carriers after their capture. Walking decks so vast and expansive, they felt like grand boulevards rather than the confines of a warship. They recounted hangar decks buzzing with countless mechanics, planes stacked in seemingly endless rows, and the pervasive, almost hypnotic hum of power that seemed utterly inexhaustible, a symphony of latent energy. For men raised in a Europe shattered by years of scarcity, rationing, and destruction, the sheer abundance, the logistical surplus aboard these floating cities, was not just impressive, it was profoundly demoralizing. It was a harrowing glimpse into a world where war was sustained not by desperate improvisation or grim sacrifice, but by an overwhelming, almost effortless capacity for production and renewal. Post-war analyses within Germany also consistently emphasized the profound symbolic meaning of the carriers. They represented America's unique and formidable ability to seamlessly merge cutting-edge technology, an unparalleled industrial economy, and a deep pragmatic concern for human welfare into incredibly potent instruments of war. Each carrier was a tangible statement, a powerful declaration that the United States could project overwhelming force anywhere on the globe, at any time, with a self-sufficiency and operational reach that effectively nullified the traditional constraints of geography itself. To many former German officers, this realization was bitter, not just because it unequivocally spelled defeat for their nation, but because it starkly revealed the inherent limits of the Reich's vision, its inability to innovate, its intellectual rigidity. Germany had gambled everything on outdated models of power, clinging to the past, while America had boldly redefined the very battlefield, embracing the future. In the years immediately following surrender, memoirs published by naval officers often carried an unmistakable undertone of awe, a grudging but profound respect for their formidable adversary. They acknowledged, with sober reflection, that no conceivable strategy, no matter how brilliant, could have matched the sheer, unstoppable momentum and the overwhelming multidimensional power of American carrier warfare. The floating cities, in their own words, were the handwriting on the wall, undeniable proof that Germany's naval dream, its ambition for global maritime power, had been doomed, tragically, from the very start. For these men, the carriers became enduring symbols of an inevitable future, stark reminders that the war had been decided not only on the blood-soaked front lines, but, perhaps even more crucially, in the factories, the shipyards, and the innovative doctrines that had shaped its inexorable course long before the first shots were ever fired. To the German officers who had once believed, with unwavering faith in the supremacy of steel and indomitable willpower, the American carriers stood as towering monuments to a new age, an age where the sea belonged not to the mightiest gun, but to the largest, most capable deck, a testament to the power of relentless innovation and overwhelming industrial might. The historical lesson bequeathed by the German officers' profound astonishment at America's aircraft carriers is one that resonates far beyond the battlefields of World War II. It speaks to the perennial human struggle with innovation, the deeply ingrained resistance to paradigm shifts, and the often painful process of recognizing a new reality when it stares us in the face. For the Kriegsmarine, their initial dismissal of carriers wasn't born of ignorance, but of a firm adherence to a successful, albeit rapidly obsolescing, doctrine. Their understanding of naval power was deeply rooted in the past, in the grand narratives of dreadnoughts and decisive gunnery duels that had defined navies for a century. The carrier, with its emphasis on air power and distributed force projection, demanded an entirely different way of thinking, a cognitive leap that proved too great for many, too late. This story underscores the critical importance of intellectual agility in military strategy, and, by extension, in any field facing rapid technological change. The German naval imagination, constrained by its continental focus and historical precedents, proved too narrow to grasp the full implications of what America was building. While they meticulously refined their U-boat tactics and perfected their battleship designs, America was fundamentally redefining the very concept of naval warfare. They were not just building bigger ships, they were building an entirely new system of power projection, one that integrated technology, logistics, and human welfare into an unstoppable force multiplier. The carriers were not merely better weapons, they were manifestations of a different philosophy of war, a philosophy of overwhelming abundance, continuous innovation, and global reach. The industrial capacity aspect is equally crucial. The German officers' unfassbar moments were not just about the ships themselves, but about the seemingly limitless American ability to produce them. This highlights that strategic advantage is often a complex interplay of tactical brilliance, technological superiority, and the underlying industrial engine that can sustain and renew that superiority. Germany, despite its initial industrial prowess, operated within severe resource constraints and an increasingly fragmented war economy. America, by contrast, leveraged its vast continental resources and a coordinated, mass-production approach to achieve an economic resilience that fundamentally altered the dynamics of attrition warfare. The lesson here is clear. Innovation without the capacity to produce and sustain it on scale can be a fleeting advantage. The ability to absorb losses and replace them quickly to maintain a relentless tempo of operations is a strategic weapon in itself, often more demoralizing than any tactical defeat. Furthermore, the narrative of German officers observing the stark differences in living conditions and crew morale on American carriers offers profound insights into the human element of warfare. Their initial dismissal of amenities like gyms and ice cream as frivolous luxuries slowly gave way to a chilling realization. These were not indulgences, but strategic investments in human capital. A well-fed, rested, and mentally supported crew was a more effective, resilient, and enduring fighting force. This contrasted sharply with the German emphasis on stoicism, sacrifice, and making do with scarcity. It reveals that the unseen factors of morale, psychological resilience, and logistical support for the individual soldier are as crucial as the visible might of steel and guns. The American approach demonstrated that investing in the welfare of its personnel directly translated into superior combat effectiveness and sustained operational capability. It was a holistic approach to total war that Germany, ironically, failed to fully embrace, focusing almost exclusively on material production and tactical brilliance. The strategic shift embodied by the carriers, from decisive gunnery duels to overwhelming air power projection, also provides a timeless lesson about disruptive technologies. The carrier was a disruptor, rendering established doctrines and formidable assets obsolete almost overnight. This is a pattern repeated throughout military history, from the longbows at Agincourt to the tank at Blitzkrieg, and it continues in today's world with AI, cyber warfare, and drone technology. Nations and militaries that fail to recognize, adapt to, and ultimately embrace disruptive technologies risk being left behind, their formidable existing assets becoming mere relics in the face of a new age of warfare. The German officers, in their post-war reflections, were forced to concede that they had prepared for the last war, not the one that America was fighting. This is a critical takeaway for any organization. The danger of clinging to old models of success, even when new paradigms are clearly emerging. Finally, the psychological impact of the carriers on the German mindset serves as a powerful reminder of how perceived overwhelming power can erode an enemy's will to fight. The unfassbar quality of the carriers, their incomprehensible scale, production, and capability, bred not just tactical defeat but a profound sense of futility. It was the realization that they were fighting not just ships, but an entire industrial civilization, a force of nature that dwarfed their own ambitions and capabilities. This psychological defeat, the erosion of belief in their ability to win, was perhaps as potent as any torpedo or bomb. The story of the German officers and America's floating cities of war is not merely a historical footnote. It is a foundational narrative in the study of military innovation, strategic adaptation, and the relentless march of technological progress. It underscores several profound lessons that remain acutely relevant today, far removed from the steel decks and smoke-filled skies of World War II. Firstly, the most enduring lesson is about the imperative of adaptability in the face of disruptive innovation. The German Kriegsmarine, despite its initial successes and highly capable personnel, became a tragic example of an institution that struggled to adapt its core doctrine to a truly revolutionary technology. Their pre-war focus on battleships and U-boats, while strategically sound for the constraints they faced, blinded many to the full potential of naval aviation, particularly when scaled to the American level. They saw carriers as supplements, not as the new core. In any era, whether military or civilian, organizations that cling to old models of success, even when new paradigms are emerging, risk not just lagging behind, but becoming entirely obsolete. The carrier wasn't just a new ship. It demanded a new way of thinking about naval power, logistics, and global strategy. Secondly, the story highlights the crucial interplay between tactical brilliance and industrial capacity. German officers were often tactically astute, and their initial U-boat campaigns were devastatingly effective. However, their tactical prowess was ultimately undone by a fundamental imbalance in industrial production and logistical resilience. America's ability to mass-produce these complex floating cities and sustain their operations globally was an overwhelming strategic asset that transcended any single tactical victory or defeat. In modern conflicts, this translates to the understanding that high-tech weaponry is only as effective as the industrial base that can produce, maintain, and replenish it. A superior weapon system, if it cannot be mass-produced or sustained, offers only a fleeting advantage. The carriers were not only powerful, they were numerous and relentlessly replaceable, a constant, inexhaustible threat. Thirdly, there's a powerful lesson in the strategic value of human welfare and morale. The German officers' astonishment at the comparatively luxurious living conditions and recreational facilities on American carriers wasn't just about envy. It was a dawning realization that these luxuries translated directly into enhanced combat effectiveness and sustained endurance. A well-fed, well-rested, and psychologically supported crew could endure longer deployments, maintain higher morale, and perform more effectively under pressure. This challenged the ingrained German philosophy of stoicism and sacrifice as the ultimate measure of military virtue. It is a reminder that in any high-stakes, demanding environment, investing in the well-being and resilience of human capital is not an indulgence, but a critical strategic imperative. Fourthly, the narrative illustrates the profound psychological impact of overwhelming, undeniable superiority. The German officers' eventual admission of futility and their use of the term unfassbar, incomprehensible, speaks to a deeper defeat than mere tactical losses. It was a realization that they were facing a force whose scale and capabilities were beyond their conceptual framework, beyond their capacity to counter. This psychological erosion, the dawning sense of facing an inexhaustible and incomprehensible adversary, can be as potent a weapon as any physical ordnance. It demonstrates that the perception of strength, the image of boundless resources and unstoppable momentum, can itself be a powerful deterrent and a demoralizing force. Finally, and perhaps most timelessly, the story of the carriers teaches us about the constant redefinition of the battlefield itself. The carrier did not just add a new dimension to naval warfare, it fundamentally reshaped the entire maritime battle space. Distance and isolation, once natural defenses, became irrelevant. The ability to project air power hundreds of miles offshore meant that no convoy was safe, no coastal defense impregnable, and no land-based air force could maintain regional dominance against a mobile airfield. This dynamic redefinition of the battlefield is a continuous process in history, driven by technology and strategic vision. Today, whether it's cyberspace, outer space, or the digital information domain, the fundamental lesson remains. Those who redefine the battlefield, who dare to imagine new dimensions of conflict, often hold the keys to future dominance. The American aircraft carrier, as observed and understood by German officers in the crucible of World War II, stands as a monumental symbol. It is a testament to the power of industrial mobilization, technological foresight, and strategic imagination. It is a stark reminder of the perils of clinging to outdated doctrines in a rapidly changing world, and it offers an enduring lesson that true strength in conflict or indeed in any competitive endeavor, stems not just from what you build, but from how you think, how you adapt, and how you sustain the most vital resource of all, the human spirit, empowered by innovation and backed by an unyielding will to shape the future. The echoes of those floating cities of war still resonate, whispering lessons to us about the nature of power, change, and the unending quest for adaptability in an ever-evolving world.